Today we tackle the mysterious meta discussed by WotC in the most recent announcement, or as I like to call it, what Chain Whirler can teach us about card game balance. Brought to you by Artifact Academy.
Interesting.
The master!
Are you ready to have some fun?
Let's go to work!
Many of you are probably aware of the fact that Magic the Gathering recently had its ban and restricted announcement, with many people having an eye on Goblin Chain Whirler as a potential target. Now, there were no changes made to Goblin Chain Whirler's legality or anything else in Standard, but part of the response that Wizards gave related to the archetype breakdown of the current Standard format. This prompted a lot of people to kind of say what's going on here, including some fairly high-level Magic personalities, noting things such as the relatively low win rates of a lot of red decks, which had been performing well in tournaments, as well as the good performance of green decks that had been widely considered to be suppressed by the red decks. What was probably the most striking was green-black Steel Leaf having an almost 56% win rate while still being the lowest ranked deck in terms of popularity. In this video, I'm going to tackle how this happens and what can we make of these numbers. What does it all mean? I'm going to break this down in a way that is accessible to people who are coming from Hearthstone or Eternal. You don't need to know very much about Magic itself to understand the contents that are going on here. I'm also going to be pivoting to talk a little bit about Artifact as well, as this is an upcoming game, and I'll be sort of expanding to talk about card games more generally later on in the video if you're not a Magic player yourself. So I just want to make a few things clear. I have no stake in this one way or another. I have no beef with Wizards of the Coast, and I have no stance one way or another on whether Chain Whirler should be banned. I used to play Magic actively in the past, but I haven't for the past couple of years. I am just an observer in all of this. I'm interested to see how it goes, and I find this topic fascinating, so that's why I'm doing this analysis. I don't have any objectives here beyond that. In order to tackle this question, let's talk a little bit about John Nash. He, of course, was made the most famous through the movie A Beautiful Mind, but really it was because of his work in the field of economics and mathematics, creating the idea of game theory. I know a lot of people's eyes glaze over when somebody mentions game theory, but the principal idea in it that's important here is that players, quote-unquote, of a game, it's actually literal players in this case, respond to incentives and will change their behavior depending on what the incentives of the system are. So let's talk about a hypothetical metagame. We have 5 decks, a white, blue, black, red, and green deck, just for simplicity's sake. The white deck has good matchups against blue and black, 60% win rate against each, and a bad matchup against red and green, 40% win rate against each. This leaves white with a 50% win rate across the board. This is true of all of the other decks with, of course, the specific matchups shifted around a little bit, but you get the idea. Ultimately, this leads to a matchup matrix that looks kind of like this, which will lead to a expected popularity and win rate that looks kind of like this, which ultimately leads to a very healthy metagame, as you can expect since everything is perfectly balanced. Now let's shift things a little bit. Let's say that the white deck has a 65% win rate against blue and black, and a 45% win rate against green and red. This, of course, shifts things, so white will now have 55% win rate against the field as a whole. This will ultimately lead to a win rate matrix that looks kind of like this, which could then lead to a popularity distribution that looks like the following, where there's a 30% presence of the white decks, 10% of each blue, black, and red, and 40% of green. Obviously, there's some players that have moved over from the blue, black, and red decks to the white deck, as well as to the green deck, which is one of the most effective counters to the deck. The results that we would get as a win rate in this hypothetical metagame is very close to 50% across the board with these adjusted levels of popularity. This ultimately looks like a fairly healthy metagame, all things considered, even though the white deck clearly has higher overall power in a vacuum compared to the rest. And if you were actually to look at this metagame and see that it was unhealthy, though, you might even point to the green deck as the potential culprit, since it is both higher in popularity and in the win rate as the white deck in this particular circumstance. Even though if you actually just look at the matchup percentages, it is not an exceptional deck by any criteria. It simply just has a good matchup against the white deck and is also good against the other counter to the white deck. Let's push things further. Let's say there's a 70% win rate against the blue and the black deck and a 48% chance against the green and the red deck, leading to a 59% win rate for white against the rest of the field. This would lead to a matchup matrix that looks kind of like this, could lead to some popularities that end up being in this sort of range, with 40% white, 5% for blue, black, and red, and 45% of the popularity going to green. The win rates would end up looking kind of like this, between 42 and 46% across the board, which is not great, but it's still in the range of healthy. And once again, it would kind of look like green might be the problem, since it's very popular still compared to the white deck. This is part of the reason also why the application of the ban hammer and the nerf hammer in various games can feel a little bit confusing to the community. The actual developers have access to this kind of data and can see the ripple effects of how things work, so they might be more likely or less likely to hit different decks based on how they think the metagame will respond to one given change. Let's talk about skill, though, next, since I think this adds a confounding factor to this that is actually really important to consider. Let's talk about a simple metagame in which we have a blue, a green, and a red deck. Blue is favored against green, green is favored against red, and red is favored against blue. These favorable matchups are worth 5% each in each of these cases. Let's actually go a step further and break it up so that we have low skill players and high skill players for each of the given decks. An average skill player playing against a low skill player would have a 5% advantage in terms of win rate, and a 5% chance of win rate would also be given to high skill players versus medium skill players. Let's also assume for the purposes of this exercise that these effects are additive, so a blue player that's of an average skill level facing against a low skill green player would have a 10% matchup advantage, and a high skill red player playing against a low skill red player would have a total of a 10% advantage as well. The matrix will ultimately look like this, but things are going to be ultimately healthy because there's no deck archetype that has a systematic advantage over anything else. Let's, of course, though, push this a little bit further. Let's say that the blue deck has a bonus for the high skill players, that it gives you more advantage, while the low skill players do worse. So this would be a deck that is basically just hard to play, that has this differentiation in the skill level win rates. This is what the resulting matrix would end up looking like. You could expect some popularities that would kind of look like this as a result in the different categories, with the corresponding win rates for the different archetypes and skill levels shown here. This is, of course, a result of high skill players moving from decks like the green deck to the blue deck, and low skill players moving from the blue deck to the red deck. One of the things that comes out as a result of this, though, is the popularity is pretty normal. We have blue at 33% of the metagame, red at 44% of the metagame, and green at 22% of the metagame. And the win rates ranging between 52 and 48%. So this looks like a pretty healthy metagame, all things considered, even though the blue deck has a pretty big advantage for the higher skilled players. Let's push things further, though, once again, to just kind of show this. I've pushed things so far that the high skill blue players no longer have any bad matchups. They're favored against everything in the field. As you can expect, the metagame has shifted up a good deal, where almost all of the high skill players have moved over to the blue deck, and some other changes in other places. You might get a population distribution that looks kind of like this. What you get next, though, is you look at the popularity at each of the decks. The blue deck is about 40% of the metagame, red is just below 40%, and green is just above 20%. Looks healthy once again. And this is with high skill blue players having no bad matchups. Now, obviously, I've conjured up these numbers myself. It's really hard to imagine these sorts of gaps given the ones that I've inserted into the matrix. These are all hypothetical, but it really does show how twisted things can end up being if there is a high skill cap deck in the format where it is overperforming in certain segments of the population, while at the same time the overall popularity and win rates seem to be relatively in control. Something that can really exaggerate this fact is when you have these high skill decks, you have somebody like a skilled player, a professional player will say, yeah, this deck is amazing, everybody should be playing it, while lower skilled players will say, well, I keep on losing with it. This ends up diluting the win percentage of the deck to make it look a lot more healthy than it is, even though at the highest skills, it's quite dominant. This leads to a lot of interesting questions. Are we going to be balancing around the professional scene, or do we care more about the casual experience? Where do we set the line between what is just merely good versus overpowered? What line do we set in terms of distortion warping of the metagame do we consider unhealthy? All of that is very contextual, but one thing I will say as a conclusion from all this, as long as a deck has at least one bad matchup, things need to be really overpowered for the metagame to totally break down. There's usually some countervailing force that's possible. As long as there's one negative matchup that they have that's possible, things can really easily balance out, even though the deck fundamentally is actually quite oppressive. Let's return, though, to the actual numbers that we saw from the MTG release. We can't really make very much of it. It's really hard to make very much of this information without more data about the win rates at various skill levels and the prevalence and popularity of the various decks. A couple of things I will note, though, that are strange about this that I have issues with. Why are there 13 decks? It's a really weird number to pull out. This is a standard thing that I learned in life. If somebody was using a weird number to show you of something, they're probably trying to prove something. In this case, we see there's a couple of green decks shown at the bottom here, which are shown to kind of counteract the narrative of green not really being present amongst the rest of the metagame. So with all of this, let's look at some other games and how they've implemented some balancing issues and how it's different than what we see in Magic, like in Hearthstone and Eternal. They, of course, though, use a league system, whether it's the Bronze through Masters League in Eternal or the 25 through Legends system in Hearthstone. Using a league system is, of course, really big advantage to stop bullying in terms of having high-skill players just beating up on low-skill players, because you're going to largely be trying to match players of similar skill levels against one another. You don't get that in something like Magic the Gathering Online. There are actually some important cons, though, on the design side when you're implementing this kind of league and MMR-based matching system. The balance becomes way more difficult for the actual game designers. The dilution effect that I talked about earlier of high skill decks and low skill decks, that effect disappears when it's always players of a similar skill level battling against one another. This is part of the reason why the archetype win rate breakdown looks so diverse for Magic the Gathering Online that we saw in the article, but maybe Grand Prix results don't look quite as diverse, where everything seems to be just a Chain Whirler deck or a Chain Whirler counter deck. I'm not saying that this is indicative of the whole metagame. This is obviously just one tournament, but this really does amplify the cream rising to the top and is crystallizing what the winner's metagame really looks like when all of the chaff has really been pushed out. We actually see in some other games that some of the balance considerations have been made based on what happens in different skill levels. There are some stories that the Undertaker changes, specifically, that happened quite a while ago now in Hearthstone, was partly because the Hunter Death Rattle strategy was so oppressive at low MMRs. Similarly, I heard in Eternal that the Morningstar changes, which happened back in the beginning of closed beta, was partly as a result of its effect in low MMR settings. It was just really overpowered there compared to other things and had some negative results of the early user experience. Things are obviously going to be quite different at different stages of the ladder, and at the bottom, these sorts of effects are going to be much different than the effect that you would see in high-level play, and you have to make the decision about what you're balancing around. This also really emphasizes just how difficult the job is for game designers. They're trying to balance both low-level play and high-level play and trying to decide the best balance between them, and that if you move one thing, then the whole thing might topple. And really, the moral of the story is it's impossible to kind of make everybody happy at the same time or like equally happy. There's always going to be somebody unhappy about one thing or another. But of course, everybody does the best job to push things as hard as they can to that state without breaking the game. Much of this turns to the question of stats sharing in card games. My personal stance is that the job of game manufacturers is to maximize the fun of the game. And if they don't feel that the fun of the game is maximized by sharing this information, then they don't really need to. Of course, when you have this information, it does lead to players doing a lot of min-maxing sort of activity. And while I think that there are a lot of people who find that sort of activity fun and that maximization fun, it can really suck the fun out of the game for a lot of other people and just turn everything into a math problem. You could argue that not have that information in some way compromises the competitive scene of the game, but I think that it's possible to live without it. Wizards of the Coast is known for having a very conservative stance about this data sharing. I really don't know personally if that's for the better or the worse of the company. I think that they are a little bit timid about it, but part of the reason is that it leads them to have a bit more freedom in terms of what they're doing with ban list announcements. other games solve this in different ways. Hearthstone, for example, has community-built websites and software, such as Visage Syndicate, that help to gather this data about matchups and win rates, and give that information to players to help them make deck choices. While a lot of people love this, there are those who think that this actually might be pushing the metagame to be solved more quickly than one might like. There's no, of course, concrete evidence and counterfactual here, but these are just some opinions that people have. Eternal, on the other hand, doesn't have any data gathering software that's like this, that's generally available, and as a result, we see a lot more diversity in the metagame up until the very high levels. Now, there are those who would then say that maybe this is a result of other factors. We don't know, the counterfactual here once again, but it's just worth noting that the card game that has the least amount of data that's available also tends to have the highest diversity. Let's end things out specifically talking about Artifact. I'm sure many of you know that Artifact is a game currently under development by Valve that's based on Dota 2. It's a card game, of course. Dota 2 itself has lots of information. There's lots of websites that you can pull information from. It's really a data-saturated, stats-saturated game relative to what's available. The developers for Artifact have also said that they're hoping to have a fairly hands-off approach to Artifact balancing and not be in the weeds, the nitty-gritty, changing things very often. At least that's the indication and impression that they've given. I feel, though, that these two stances could be kind of in contention as the game goes forward. Let's imagine that when Artifact is released, we have enough tools that we can really just research what deck we were supposed to be playing. You can imagine the metagame getting pretty stale pretty quickly, which is unfortunate. Alternatively, you can imagine the metagame just kind of breaks, and people are quickly able to identify what deck is best, and things really warp as a result of that. Of course, it's possible that we get a metagame where things just evolve rapidly, or there's just constant iterations and seeing what's happening next. Of course, we don't know what this will end up showing up, and I'm excited to see how it will end up turning out, but this is, I think, a challenge that Valve is going to have to end up facing sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for hanging out for this video. This, of course, is brought to you by Artifact Academy. You can subscribe, like, and share to support the channel, comment, Twitter me, or Reddit in order to share your thoughts about the video, which I try to respond to as best I can. There's a lot of links below that you can check out. Thank you once again. It means a lot to me. Take care.